Hello, everyone. My name is Liz Seaton, and I am a curator at the Mariana Kistler Beach Museum of Art at Kansas State University. Welcome to this program, Trees in the Grasslands, Three Perspectives, organized in conjunction with the exhibition Field Guide to a Hybrid Landscape, photographs by Dana Fritz, on view through August 2nd. So we're very fortunate today to have with us photographer Dana Fritz, biologist Jesse Nippert, and environmental reporter Carson Vaughan. I'll introduce them in greater depth in a moment. First, a few thank yous. We'd like to express our gratitude to the Greater Manhattan Community Foundation's Lincoln and Dorothy I. Deal Community Grants Program, and David and Judy Regier for supporting the exhibition and its programs. Some information about the format of today's program. We're scheduled to be on air until 7 p.m. Central Time. How close we come to that time will depend on the length of the Q&A portion of the program. We have about 100 people registered, which is really exciting, so we hope you'll have a lot of questions. Dana, Carson, and Jesse are going to use some slides at first to talk about their work on projects related to the topic of trees in the grasslands, and they'll speak for about 10 minutes each. And we're going to try to make this as much of a conversation as possible. So during the presentation portion, panelists feel free to ask each other questions and make comments. I may do that too. Then after the presentations, I'll stop sharing the slides and we'll come up in a larger view and continue the conversation. And when it seems right, I'll bring in questions from the audience. If you, our audience, would like to pose a question or comment, you can do so at any time. Just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type in your question, and then we'll look for that during the second half of the program. Closed captioning is available for those who would like to use it. Click on CC at the bottom of your screen. Finally, this program is being recorded and will be accessible on the museum's YouTube channel. I also want to thank Jen Harlan, who I think is pictured at the bottom of the group of videos. She's our project coordinator, programs coordinator, I should say, and she's helping us today with tech and looking at the Q&A. Thanks, Jenna. So I'm about to get to speaker introductions, but before I do, I'd like to say one thing to put the content of this program in context. You just viewed K-State's Indigenous Land Acknowledgement. I hope you had a chance to read it in full. I think it's important to mention that we are talking today about histories of land management in the Great Plains during the 20th and 21st centuries, a little bit of the late 19th century. We should recognize that Indigenous peoples inhabited this territory for centuries before this. I think our speakers will touch on the ways in which Native Americans used and cared for the prairies before non-native settlers, backed by the US government, took control of their lands. So let me introduce our speakers. Carson Vaughan is a freelance journalist from central Nebraska with a focus on the Great Plains. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Guardian, Outside, and more. His first book, Zoo Nebraska, The Dismantling of an American Dream, earned a 2020 Nebraska Book Award. Vaughan's second book, A Travelogue Through the Nebraska Sandhills, will be published by W.W. Norton and Company. Jesse Nippert is a University Distinguished Professor of Biology at Kansas State University. He has led the long-term ecological research program at Konza Prairie since 2017. He studies plant physiological responses to climate change in North American grasslands and Southern Africa savannas. For the past 15 years, Nippert has studied the drivers and consequences of shrub expansion into grassy ecosystems. And finally, Dana Fritz is Hixson-Lied Professor of Art and a Center for Great Plains Studies Fellow at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Her photography has been exhibited widely across the United States, Europe, and Asia, and it has appeared in numerous publications, some produced by her, including the book created to complement her photography of a Nebraska National Forest District. That book, Field Guide to a Hybrid Landscape, was published by the University of Nebraska Press and was the recipient of the 2024 Nebraska Book Award for Nonfiction, Nebraska as Place category. Fritz was raised in Prairie Village, Kansas, I will also mention. And Dana, I think you're going to get us started with a presentation of your Nebraska National Forest project.
That's right. Thanks, Liz. And thanks to everyone who's here today, this evening. I want to thank Liz and the staff at the Beach Museum for their support of my exhibition visit and this Zoom. And also thank my co-presenters, Carson and Jesse, whose important work that I really admire. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So I am going to start with my project Field Guide to a Hybrid Landscape. And you can go to the next slide. And that project traces the environmental history of Nebraska's hand-planted forest, one of the most enduring efforts to bring trees to the grasslands in the Great Plains. Next slide. Okay.
I'm having a little trouble with my keyboard. I'm moving on to my
to your mouse.
notes.
Okay. Okay. Obviously, we're sharing a slideshow here. Nebraska sits on top of the Ogallala or High Plains Aquifer, and the Sandhills ecoregion is a large part of our state. Right in the middle of it is the Bessie Ranger District of the Nebraska National Forest and Grasslands, the site of my project. At the time of European settlement, Nebraska was 97% grassland, and in the sandhills, which are not good for planting crops, much of the grasslands remain. This ecoregion was recently declared the world's largest intact prairie. And when I first visited the forest, I was completely fascinated and confused about an 80 square kilometer hand planted forest in the middle of this vast grassland. The forest is a rare disruption in this prairie ecosystem, and I wanted to understand how it happened. This hybrid landscape was a University of Nebraska botany professor, Dr. Charles Bessie's ambitious late 19th century plan to create a timber industry and to change the local climate. At that time, tree planting was not considered in terms of carbon sequestration, but as a way to mitigate the wind and evaporation of moisture and to bring order to what they thought was a disorderly landscape. Bessie's plan took shape in the late 1800s, an era of widespread industrial deforestation in the eastern US, and when Nebraska became known as the tree planter state before we were the Cornhusker state. After some relatively successful sandhills tree planting experiments, Bessie convinced the US government to set aside a portion of the sandhills as a forest reserve, even though no forest yet existed. This tree planting project was supported by Nebraskans in part because of J. Sterling Morton's efforts. In the late 19th century, enthusiasm for tree planting in Nebraska was already widespread, although it was directed mostly at belts and groves near settlements and not afforestation per se. J. Sterling Morton, who founded Arbor Day, which is occurring this week, in 1872, could not abide what he saw as a barren landscape in eastern Nebraska. And like many of his time, Morton operated from an extractive settler colonial perspective and felt that he, although an outsider, knew what was best for the people and land of Nebraska. And he proclaimed a goal of making Nebraska our nation's best timbered state. And celebration of Arbor Day worldwide throughout these years has turned him into a cult figure of sorts, but his legacy is complicated at best. These photographs are by Solomon Butcher and describe both the settlers' need for timber and the longing for trees in this vast grassland. On the left is the photographer with his first sod house in 1880, and on the right is a photograph in which Butcher has drawn in the missing trees. Most of the people who settled in Nebraska came from Europe or eastern states where trees and forests were part of life and lore. Like anyone enacting the settler colonial narrative, they brought ideas and plants from their previous homes to remake the new land into something they recognized. The Forest Reserve was established in 1902 on land that was coercively transferred to the United States government through treaties and cessions with the Pawnee and Sioux in the 1850s and 60s. And before dispossession, the generally treeless character of the land co-evolved with grazing bison and other herbivores. Lightning caused wildfires and indigenous practices of cultural burning that moved game and refreshed the grass, among other things. Today, the sandhills are mostly managed by private settler descendant landowners as ranches, and only a few of those people use prescribed fire to maintain the grasslands. This is the largest hand-planted forest in the Western Hemisphere and formerly in the world. It doesn't have the same beauty as a native forest, and often it feels like being on a tree farm or a ranch. And I had to work hard to find compositions with my camera, so I wasn't in it inherently for the beauty of the place. I was in it for the ideas. This page spread from my tiny sketchbook shows how I was thinking about the hand-planted forest. I was overwhelmed by the complexity of the subject and was looking for ways to organize it in my mind and in my studio. I thought about grass and trees, empty and full, light and dark, native and introduced, fire and water, grids, edges, rows, waves, and stacks, and so much more. This photograph of a treeless sandhills horizon with a planted pine in the foreground appears early in the book. It, like the previous panoramas, establishes that this landscape is a hybrid of forest and grassland. The term hybrid refers to something that is purposefully mixed and has origins in the Latin hybrida, offspring from a tame sow and a wild boar. This purposeful mixture of forest and grassland is a defining characteristic and echoes the concept of combining the tame with the wild. Even the old National Forest principle, land of many uses, prescribed hybridity, simultaneously managing for timber, grazing, and recreation. But my field guide project is also a hybrid, part photo book, part atlas, part environmental history, and part speculation. The book could not have been made without field visits, but its best use is not in the field. This book is organized in a novel taxonomy of the forces shaping the hybrid landscape, and they are sand, wind, water, planting, thinning, fire, decomposition, and sowing. And these are archival photographs that represent these forces. Each chapter opens with a commission map, a short introductory text, and a photograph from the USDA Forest Service's archives. These are followed by a series of my photographs that reveal the forces shaping the land. So the pairs of images I'll show are also page spreads from the book. The first chapter is sand, wind, and water. And here you can see that the wave patterns are present at various scales in the sandhills from the air and on the sandy riverbeds. Off-road vehicle tracks are perpetually erased by strong winds. Throughout the book are repeated human and non-human patterns, including lots of waves and rows. I chose black and white over color photographs to emphasize the patterns. The second chapter is on planting. This land was generally deemed unsuitable for crops, yet seedlings were planted in furrows at regular intervals with wide unplanted areas to stop wildfires. This pair shows the order of planting and the disorder of invasive trees. Planted ponderosa pines tower above volunteer eastern red cedars spreading in profusion. The next chapter is about thinning, which is part of silvicultural practice, but also now necessary to mitigate fire danger. The cut trees are stacked into piles that will be eventually burned or sold for mulch, but until the conditions are right for prescribed fire, these piles remain a great source of fuel for wildfires. Over a century, management here has shifted from afforestation to grassland restoration. This requires removal of invasive trees that have encroached on grassland areas because fires were prohibited by the Forest Service for most of the 20th century. Embracing fire as a natural process of both forest and grassland ecosystems, the U.S. Forest Service now sets prescribed fires when conditions are safe in spring. On the left, this low intensity prescribed fire burned grass, fallen branches, and shrubs on the forest floor, but left the canopy intact. On the right, the medium intensity wildfire reached higher into the trees, killing some, but many recovered. This chapter is about decomposition, which happens slowly in this semi-arid climate. Here, a fallen tree is buried in pine needles that take an average of 7 years to decompose. Bark falls off a dead tree after the thin layer of living cells under it is gone, and this makes way for insects and fungi to decompose the wood. The final chapter of the book is about sowing seeds. The first federal tree nursery was founded here to grow seedlings for the treeless forest reserve. Seedlings for reforestation are now grown at an industrial scale in Bessie nursery greenhouses. And while the nursery no longer supports afforestation in the adjacent grasslands, it serves as a seed bank and assists in critical climate change mitigation and resilience in native forests. The right photograph, you can see Highway 2 and the nursery beds, the river, the greenhouses, the planted trees, and the sandhills on the horizon. This isn't the whole forest, but it gives you a sense of what's out there. This photograph comes at the end of my book, foregrounding the grasslands as past and future. This unique landscape of row crop trees that were protected from the natural cycle of fire for decades, yet unsuccessful as a timber source, provided a rich metaphor for our current environmental predicaments. This hybrid landscape has evolved from a late 19th century effort to reclaim with trees what was called the Great American Desert, to a focus on 21st century conservation, grassland restoration, and reforestation in native forests, all of which work to sequester carbon, maintain natural ecosystem balance, and mitigate large-scale climate change. I hope the book offers a critical examination and a case study of a unique managed landscape that has implications far beyond its borders. So Field Guide to a Hybrid Landscape was published in January 2023 by University of Nebraska Press. A book and exhibitions of this scale could not be possible without a great deal of support. So I need to thank the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for funding from the Hixson-Lied College of Fine and Performing Arts and the Office of Research and Economic Development. The book has commissioned maps and essays by an art historian, a geographer, and a forest ecologist that help tease out this complicated environmental history. As this book was going to press in October 2022, the catastrophic Bovie fire burned a quarter of the trees. In extreme drought conditions with piles of fuel ready to burn, very little can stop a fire, whether it starts from lightning or a spark from an ATV. This view from the fire tower that's the cover of my book is no longer possible, since both the tower itself and many of the trees in the photograph burned. The published book is much more of a historical document than I imagined it would be, even as I was finishing it. Field Guide to a Hybrid Landscape is the last and most complete visual account of the hand-planted forest as it was. After the fire, I felt compelled to produce a postscript that would update my historical trade book. Pitch oozes through the charred bark of a mature ponderosa pine in a futile attempt to save itself. Wind and rain mix sand and ash into patterns of erosion. Trunks of row-planted eastern red cedar cast shadows on bare sand. Burned trees are cut and stacked for the first timber sale in this failed lumber production experiment. The towering log decks will not remain, even as dead trees are fuel for future wildfires. Native grasses and forbs grow vigorously after a regenerative fire. Horizontal trees bear the marks of logging machines and bark beetles. Burned chips of bark, dry needles, and pine cones decompose on the forest floor, and a pine seed sprouts from the ashes. I'm really grateful to have support to exhibit this work from a Puffin Foundation artist grant. And this is a view from the exhibition at the Beach Museum, which is included where the book is there with 40 prints. Thanks.
Thank you, Dana. This is a really fascinating place, and I should mention that you and I had a chance to be there together last summer while you were photographing some of the post-fire, the evidence of the post-fire.
Yep.
And period. And so I wanted to ask, do you think you could tell us a little bit more about the history of the planting? I find that very interesting.
Maybe. I mean,
and it happened, you mentioned that a lot of it happened in the New Deal period.
Yeah. So it started in 1903. I mean, I think it was approved as a forest reserve in 1902. Maybe Carson can correct me on this because he's done a lot of research too. And I think they started planting in earnest after they had grown the seedlings in 1903. And then they planted it literally by hand. They didn't have a lot of machines to help. They used like horse-drawn tractors and like really basic stuff. And then as technology improved, they had more, I guess, mechanical and industrial ways to plant. And I think there were certainly many, many, many people working for the CCC planting in the 30s. That's how I understand like the most of the planting was done. But the planting continued pretty steadily, I think, until about 1965 when there was a huge fire and there was a kind of reckoning in the same way that the reckoning has happened again after this fire.
Yeah, and you've told me that the nursery, which helped supply the seedlings for the original planting, is also now, you mentioned this, supplying other forests that have been hit by fires. And
they have quite a few contracts with the U.S. Forest Service, but most of their trees, I think, go to forests in what they call the Rocky Mountain District, which includes Wyoming and Colorado. And so I did another project called Reforest, where I followed the trees and found some that were 20 years old and some that were really recent, and places that are likely to be reforested if there's funding after the big fires in I think 2000 is when the really big fires were in Wyoming and Colorado.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Carson or Jesse, do you have any questions too?
I have sort of an amateur question for you, Dana. You've spent a lot of time there as an artist, and you've spent a lot of time there, as a professor and a professional. But I'm curious, as somebody who grew up with the forest already in place, I grew up in the Sandhills, so it was always just part of my background. As somebody who, encountered it for the first time well into adulthood, what was your just that first gut reaction to seeing this forest in the Sandhills?
Well, I mean, I think I had a gut reaction when I heard about it. And my husband said, "Hey, we're driving to the Black Hills. We should stop at this forest. It's planted by hand." And I thought, that's crazy. Okay, so we did. And I, climbed up the fire tower like people do. There's a paved road right up to it, and looked out and was like, wow, this is kind of crazy. If you see beyond the forest, it's sandhills. And it is really an anomaly out there. And if you think about it and you get close to the trees, you realize that each one of those was like a human effort. I mean, there are self-sown trees there too, but most of them you can still see some rows. And it was just, when you think about how does this happen, you think about a lot of human effort, right? So, but I saw it many years, probably 6 or 8 or 10 years before I started the project. But I started the project because I wanted to do something about I wanted to understand Nebraska better since I am committed to living here, living out my days here. And I've been here for 27 years. And, I think at that time I really wanted to work a little bit closer to home, although this is not next door to me. Um, and I wanted to understand like what was the thinking that made this happen and how is it related to climate change? The original idea was to change the local climate, and now it has kind of a different function, or at least until recently, it was really part of climate change mitigation. Although it is a, a space that is extremely challenged by our changing climate and by drought. And certainly the fire was such a huge change for me. I wasn't there during the fire. And in fact, no one could go there. Well, Carson slipped in, but most people weren't allowed to go in right after the fire. It took me a couple months to get there. And it was shocking to me to see it. Yeah.
I guess my quick follow-up to that is sounds like when you first saw it, you were already sort of aware of like the human effort of planting each and every tree there. But did that like skew your sort of human experience being in a forest?
Well, it's the weirdest forest. Like it doesn't feel like, I mean, I spent so much time in this one that I felt like it was really important that I needed to go to some native forests and to feel what they were like because they're not like this one. And actually, a lot of those native forests have also been logged and reforested. So they're not unmanaged. And then, I had been doing other projects about uh, gardens and sort of like managed land at every scale, right? And including this project Terraria Gigantica about the world's largest enclosed landscape. So those were a massive human effort to create a landscape. So in some ways, it's very similar to this, like a grand effort. But what I learned through all of this is to really remember that land has always been managed. And there are different management philosophies. And this represents a certain kind of one that was really like a late 19th century one that continued through the 20th century. And but it's not like the land wasn't managed before. It was managed. And that's, as Liz mentioned, like I think that's really important to remember. A lot of the European settlers did not recognize that management. They didn't understand it, but it was managed.
Carson, I have a question for both of you. Just maybe one more question before we move on to your presentation. You were there, and I've read a story that you wrote about, pardon me, about the fire. And you had some interesting questions about what its future might be or the decisions that needed to be made about it. And at the end of your article, could you talk a little bit about what you learned or what you contemplated, what you were told?
Yeah,
Maybe.
I mean, when I was
Also, any
reading,
updates, because that was a couple years ago.
it was, and I'm probably not the best for updates because I haven't been myself, I will admit, in probably 2 or 3 years now. It's been a while, probably since the fire, honestly. But I remember racing out there during the Bovie fire, and you're right, Dana, somehow I slipped through the cracks and was able to like see it before it had been completely put out. But my immediate questions were, you know, it's an artificial forest in the middle of a largely treeless prairie. There is no like baseline standard for management in that situation. The whole thing is artificial. So do you go back to replanting trees? Do you look at what we've learned about ecology since then and let the grassland try to filter back in? Which side is the Forest Service going to fight for? These were all questions that like naturally bubbled up. Do you try to manage it for snag habitat and just leave the dead trees in place? Does the Forest Service go in and cut those and do the sale and do what they do in regular natural forests? There's just, we can have a large debate about whether this should have been planted in the first place. The answer is probably no. But
Right.
Now that it's there, I do find it incredibly fascinating in terms of how do we ecologically move forward with this thing that never should have existed in the first place. I talked to a lot of ecologists who said, it's here now. I look at it essentially like a giant city park. That's obviously going to be artificial. Let's continue to experiment, get the most good out of it now that it's there. I've talked to others who say it was a mistake. Let's manage for prairie and be done with it. So, I don't know what side I land in personally, but I just find the questions themselves are pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I guess I can just add a little bit to that, which even though it's not on maps as an experimental forest, like there are some in other parts of the country, it was an experiment. It's an experimental forest. And while my book may look like the whole thing burned down, certainly it did not. This was like the actually an interesting place of where it burned was like close to the paved roads, and you can see it from Highway 2 and close to the entrance. And if you keep going farther south, it's just like it was. I mean, there are sections of it that burned in 2012 and some from before that, but this was one of the biggest fires. And but they did do a clear cut because the trees are dead, but they're not ash. And so there's still a fire danger. So some of these views in my book aren't even there anymore. They've been cut. And so the log deck, there's like that middle page that is the giant log deck. That one, there were quite a lot of those, and they're selling timber. So if you want to get some, it's there, and they need to get rid of it because it is a still fuel for a fire. And what I understand about it is if they plant anything again in the way of trees, it'll be small plots to test things. Maybe they'll plant like, I don't know, like fruit trees, or they'll plant like to see what could grow there. Or maybe they'll do assisted migration where they get ponderosa pine seedlings from New Mexico or somewhere south of here and see how they do, so they can test for climate change with assisted migration. So, I mean, it's some interesting things they can do. I have no idea what will happen now. I don't think I think the budget for this kind of stuff seems to be changing every day. And I also think that the new idea is like to cut all of it as if that would keep it from burning. That would just cause a lot of erosion, I think. So, I mean, it's not just that's not going to save it. So, yeah, it'll be an experiment forever, I think.
That's interesting.
And
Yeah.
one thing I might add quickly, Liz, one of the best or most interesting things I heard when reporting that story, I'm probably going to butcher her name now. It's been quite a while, but I interviewed a woman who wrote a book about like the history of afforestation in America. I think her name was Rosetta Elkins. She was a Harvard professor. But she said, the Nebraska National Forest was essentially planted. It is a plantation, right? A true forest is in multiple states of growth and burning and repair and decay and all of that. So she was looking at the Bovie fire as just another step closer to becoming an actual forest. We'll see what regrowth occurs. The old trees will remain. Looking at it in terms of like different patches of growth and decay and all of that helped me look at it as, maybe not the disaster some of us thought it was when we first heard that a quarter of the forest had burned down.
Yeah. Yeah, just one more thing. Some of my colleagues here are studying the forest in all kinds of ways. And this fire burned so hot because we were in such a terrible drought that all the soil material really burned. And so there are some areas that will kind of bounce back, and there are others that are kind of like going to have a hard time coming back. It's going to be a real mosaic. It's going to be really interesting. But certainly the areas that were grassland came back amazingly right away because after this fire, the weather patterns changed and it snowed a lot and it rained a lot. And the comeback of the grasses was incredible.
There'll be a lot of opportunities for research, it sounds like. And I also was struck by how much it's still used for recreation when I was there. That hadn't been as easy for me to tell from the photographs that were concentrating on the patterns that you mentioned.
The fire only stopped
camping
people
and
briefly from using their ATVs out there.
yeah, picnicking, all those sorts of things happening still. Okay, well, Carson, you ready?
Yes, I am. All right. Well, again, thank you, Liz, for the introduction, and thanks to Dana and the Beach Museum for asking me to be on the panel this evening. I've been writing about trees on the prairie from one angle or another for several years now, and so I thought I might start today with a little color from the field. I'm going to circle back to the sandhills, I promise, but I want to start about an hour south in the Los Canyons of south central Nebraska. Next slide. And when I first toured the area to report on the eastern red cedar invasion, rancher Scott Stout, the guy in the cowboy hat here, sitting next to his father-in-law, Gary Nelson, he told me a story. It was more of a parable, really, from the cab of his pickup truck. And it went something like this. Back in the 70s, he said, everybody had Herefords. So his neighbor had Herefords too. And his big old horn bull kept running against a cedar tree, running that fat white head up and down the branches, twisting his beefy brown neck around the trunk. It was just a seedling, maybe 3-4 feet tall, but still, it was a treat. The old man, this Stout's neighbor, watched from his idling truck, simmering to a boil, until he grew so mad he slammed his foot on the gas and thunk, struck the 1,800-pound bull, forcing it at last to mosey on. The moral of this story, I think, if Stout's neighbor had known then what every rancher out there knows today, he would have encouraged the rest of his herd to spread out and find a seedling of its own. Now, Stout told me this story with a certain knowingness, the kind of humility that dropped his shoulders, the way his neighbor probably told him. One way or another, they've all been there, one step back, a few steps back, a few decades behind. Most of them are still catching up. So as Stout and I drove around out there, the Los Canyons were choked with cedar. They were still green in early February. The females were pregnant with thousands of baby blue cones. The trees hide everything, he told me. The fences, the sick calves, the buck they shot last fall, the bones it left behind. On to the next slide, please. So Stout's Ranch, the NN Ranch, it provides a useful case study, I think, when thinking about the Green Glacier and its practical impact on landowners. Stout married into the ranch in the late 90s, and at that time, the trees were still an afterthought. Maybe a gaggle hugging the fence post, a lone sprout in the ditch. Then came the drought in 2002. All their grass dried up. Suddenly, the cedar trees were impossible to ignore. They were the only green left standing in his pasture. He leased another 1,000 acres to avoid downsizing his herd. He sowed extra forage on irrigated cropland. Then he was forced to downsize anyway. He shipped off 75 head to make room for his remaining 350. And that whole time, the cedars were out there just silently mocking him, loitering in the draw, bobbing in the breeze, eating up so many acres where his cows could have grazed if only for another day or two. It was at that point that Stout realized just how much of his land had truly been seized and how much productivity had been lost. So within 2 years, he finally purchased the skid loader with the tree share attachment. He spent weeks in the open air cab, but for every tree he cut, he told me, 2 or 3 more seemed to spring from the neighboring hillside, or the hillside beyond that. It was like a sort of arboreal whack-a-mole, futile and increasingly unfunny. And with each new year, he found himself renting a few more acres than the last, failing to reconcile the numbers. By 2008, the so-called Green Glacier had swallowed nearly half their ranch, half their 7,000-acre spread. Areas he once drove in his truck were now inaccessible even via horseback. And come spring, so much pollen just loitered above the canyons it looked like a cloud of smoke. Next slide. So I want to quickly zoom out on the Green Glacier, and I know that Dana covered a bit, and Jesse definitely is going to cover some. But thanks to roughly 200 years of fire suppression on the Great Plains, the eastern red cedar tree, a drought-tolerant native once confined to river bottoms and rocky outcrops, is now exponentially dismantling one of the most iconic and endangered ecosystems in the world, the American prairie. Between 1999 and 2018 alone, tree cover in the Great Plains increased by nearly 44 million acres. That's roughly the size of Oklahoma. That's a major threat to nearly every ecosystem service our native grasslands provide. Wildlife habitat, forage for cattle, groundwater filtration, aquifer recharge, erosion control, more, to say nothing of all the new issues it adds to the equation. Tick and mosquito-borne disease, wildfire risk, so much more. I think Dr. Nippert is going to dive into some of those next, but if not, we can always circle back. But while the Green Glacier has been relegated for decades already to the dusty confines of trade journals and agricultural conventions, many scientists warn it's the gravest threat to our native grasslands since the Great Plow-Up of the early 20th century. Next slide. But not all is lost in the Los Canyons. In fact, though it's still being written, it's starting to look a little bit like a story of redemption. Amidst that same drought in 2002, a windmill repairman sparked a wildfire just north of those canyons. It ultimately burned roughly 20,000 acres, and though it was accidental, the results encouraged Stout and a handful of his neighbors to form what they called the Los Canyons Rangeland Alliance. It was a whole new array of grasses. They grew back after the Brady Fire. They were denser and more varied than before. The wildflowers stippled the canyons. The smallest cedars seemed to be eradicated, and the larger now stood naked, skeletal, their foliage at least no longer blocking the sun. Now, since then, Stout and his neighbors have reclaimed nearly 90,000 acres of mixed grass prairie. Their pastures now produce roughly 3,000 more pounds of forage per acre. Grassland obligate birds increased across 65% of the region. And according to Direct Woodwell at UNL, who helped guide some of those efforts, the LCRA is the first documented group to halt the Green Glacier on a regional scale. Next slide, please. Okay, so Dana touched on some of this briefly as well. But at this point, you might be asking, okay, sure, but how did we get here in the first place? And I know Jesse's going to speak to the science of the Green Glacier far better than I can. But what makes this issue perpetually fascinating for me as a journalist is that it's as much of a social issue as it is an environmental one. In the case of eastern red cedar specifically, perhaps even more so. For thousands of years, the Plains Indian tribes had set fire to the prairie for a host of ingenious reasons, rejuvenating vegetation, attracting bison herds, to ward off mosquitoes and snakes, to ease travel, even to hinder their enemies in battle. Intentionally or not, they were also, in conjunction with lightning and the massive herds of grazing bison, keeping that Green Glacier at bay. Next slide. Of course, when the first white settlers began encroaching on the prairie, that whole ancient paradigm was interrupted. They started plowing sod and sowing seed and rewriting what they mistook as the Great American Desert in the image of their forested homelands back east. Nebraska novelist Willa Cather captured that sentiment in her novel My Antonia when she wrote, "Trees were so rare in that country, and they had to make such a hard fight to grow, that we used to feel anxious about them and visit them as if they were persons. It must have been that scarcity of detail and that tawny landscape that made detail so precious." Now, settlers celebrated these precious details, especially the cedar, with place names. If you look at a map of the Great Plains today, you're going to find them everywhere. Cedar Butte, Cedar Canyon, Cedar Creek, Cedar Lake, Cedar Rapids, Cedar River, Cedar County, Cedar Township, Cedar Bluffs. The list goes on. Willa Cather herself grew up on Cedar Street in downtown Red Cloud, Nebraska. Scott Stout lives on Cottonwood Road. Next slide. But beyond the yeoman efforts of these private landowners, there's also a long history of public tree planting campaigns on the prairie. You've heard about some of them already. Arbor Day, for example, proposed by a very racist newspaper editor and orchardist. The tree planting holiday was first recognized by Nebraska's Ag Board in 1872. It's now celebrated in all 50 states and dozens of countries worldwide. And when I first read this stat, it blew me away. But according to the New York Times, within the first 16 years of that holiday becoming established, more than 600 million trees have been planted in Nebraska alone. 1 year later, continuing on in this narrative timeline, Congress passed the Timber Culture Act, which was sort of a complement to the Homestead Act, offering an additional 160 acres of free land to anyone who planted trees on a quarter of it. That was later amended to, I think, 10% or something like that. It got less and less. The same year, actually, Nebraska passed a law of its own sentencing anyone who willfully destroyed more than $35 worth of trees on another's property to at least 1 full year of hard labor in the state pen, if not the decade maximum. This quote in the lower left-hand corner is by an author named Everett Dick, who wrote a great book called Conquering the Great American Desert. His quote about tree planting in Nebraska is my favorite. In those gun-toting days in Nebraska, he said, "If you had something against your neighbor, it was safer to whip out your gun and shoot him than to cut down his tree." Not long after that, UNL botany professor Charles Bessey, Dana introduced you to him already, he started lobbying the federal government for the establishment of a national forest in the middle of the sandhills. He was certain the grass-covered sand dunes had been forested once already, and he was certain they could be again. So after years of research, decades of tireless politicking, his pet project was finally approved in 1902 when Teddy Roosevelt withdrew more than 200,000 acres from the homestead entry and established 2 new forest reserves in the heart of the sandhills. Today, as Dana mentioned, the Bessie Ranger District is the largest hand-planted forest in the Western Hemisphere and was once the largest in the world. And lastly, in 1935, FDR spearheaded the Prairie States Forestry Project, also known as the Shelter Belt Program, as a tool for curbing the Dust Bowl. All in all, that program planted nearly 18,000 miles of windbreaks up and down the Great Plains. Next slide, please. Which brings us to today. The USDA continues to encourage tree planting through cost share initiatives like the Conservation Reserve Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. As so many landowners have told me during my reporting, these same programs also now provide incentives for tree removal. Scott Stout actually taped the editorial cartoon you're looking at right here above his desk at the ranch. As you can see, the frame is divided in the middle by a barbed wire fence. On one side, a farmer's angrily cutting cedars from his prairie using a skid loader, just like Stout. On the other side, a farmer's happily planting a cedar windbreak. Both of them shared the same thought bubble that says, "I sure am thankful for the cost-sharing funds." On this irony aside, for roughly 150 years, government at nearly every level then has preached the gospel of tree planting in the Great Plains while largely neglecting the value of the prairie itself. And the public has largely followed suit, multiplying the seed source at every turn, the cost not yet visible on the horizon, the cedar not yet disrupting wildlife, not yet strangling the rangeland, not yet exacerbating wildfire or stealing moisture or chipping away at the very foundations of the grassland biome. Of course, it is now. Next slide, please.
Right. There we go.
There we go. Thank you. So I promised we'd return to the sandhills, and I know I'm running short on time, so I'll hurry this up. Unlike the Los Canyons, the Nebraska sandhills, where I was born and raised, have so far avoided the worst of the Green Glacier. Stout told me that, and this is his quote, he caught a lot of shit from his family back home when he and his neighbors first started burning. Most of the ranchers in the sandhills are exceedingly reluctant to burn. A wayward flame can run for dozens of miles, unobstructed by roads or rivers or irrigated cropland. And if the hills ignite after the growing season's finished, they're left with little more than drifting sand and hungry cattle. And weren't their grandparents desperate for those trees anyway? Didn't they save their dishwater and dote on the seedlings? Next slide, please. Now, Stout tells me, the prescribed burns are about all his relatives want to talk about. Because what the Los Canyons already is, the sandhills, barring some sort of radical change to the status quo, will likely become. What you're looking at here is actually his brother Jeff's ranch near the Calamus Reservoir on the eastern edge of the sandhills. You can see running down the middle there, his old, well-established shelter belt. It's a half-mile long and 6 rows deep. It's running right down the middle of his pasture. And then outside of it, all those little dots are the army of tiny recruits running away. Jeff clear-cut this exact valley just 5 years ago. He told me they should have burned it too. You've really got to get the most good out of what you have, he told me. They don't make any more land. So hopefully that all gives you some sort of foundational context for woody encroachment on the prairie, at least some sort of primer, and the risks they now pose. And I'm looking forward to any questions you might have, but for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Liz.
Thank you. That was fascinating. So many thoughts come to mind. Do Jesse or Dana, do you have any questions first?
I just kind of have a comment and a question for Carson. I feel like Carson and I might be the two biggest nerds about the hand-planted forest. So I'm glad that we know each other.
I agree.
But I was wondering like how because you've written a few things about Eastern red cedar, and I just wondered how you got kind of fascinated by that as well. And also the other tree stories you've written.
Yeah, I really did. I mean, I don't think of myself as a journalist as ever really having any answers, but I feel like my reporting has allowed me to look at, both sides of things. And a big 180 that happened to me in the course of my reporting was I had written a story in conjunction with the Food and Environment Reporting Network and the Weather Channel when they were still doing long form stuff. And that story was all about how detrimental it was to states in the Great Plains that we were ripping out our shelter belts. At the time, I was thinking of shelter belts as like the big cottonwood shelter belts that I knew of growing up. not knowing that a lot of those shelter belts were planted with eastern red cedar, not knowing anything yet about how invasive they can be despite their native status. And so I got really into shelter belts. They were a big part of like the landscape of my youth. I loved them. I hated seeing ranchers and farmers tearing them out. You would drive by and just see these big like mortar piles of ancient old cottonwoods laying in the pasture, and I hated it. And I talked to a lot of, arborists and ecologists who agreed that it did help curb the Dust Bowl and that it was sort of a shame to see them go. Then I stumbled into this whole thing about the Green Glacier, and I felt like I had to really at least halfway backtrack. Windbreaks on their own are not inherently evil. In fact, they serve a lot of great purposes, but we haven't always been so intentional about the species we're using to plant those windbreaks. We certainly wouldn't continue, though some are, to use eastern red cedar trees today. So seeing both sides of that, I just felt like this was a crazy, interesting dynamic happening in my backyard in Nebraska. And as a guy who considers himself an environmentalist and somebody who always equated environmentalism with tree planting, I loved that became a more nuanced conversation.
Hey, Carson, can I ask you a quick question?
Please, yeah.
What proportion of Jeff Stout's neighbors share his viewpoint, and like what proportion of his ranching neighbors there in the Lusk Canyons have the more like, from the political cartoon you showed, more of the like planting shelter belts? Like, what's the demographic breakdown of these two different viewpoints in that region?
Sure. Well, Scott Stout is the one who lives in the Loess Canyon.
Oh,
And I
okay.
think at this point, actually, I should say, I think by 2015, so maybe 13 or 14 years into the Rangeland Alliance existing, he had buy-in from 50 of his neighbors, which, 50 ranchers, that's a lot of land. So they're doing pretty well. And as far as I know, I haven't talked to Scott in a couple of years now, but every year it seemed to progress, a few more getting on board. The hardest years obviously are in the beginning when they have zero like proof of concept, where they're just hoping that people buy into this idea that fire will take care of it and that it's not going to run out of control. So, he talked about those first years being super hard. He was a lonely guy out there trying to claim that, prescribed burns were going to help. What really changes is when they get to see the results a year, 2 or 3 in of those pastures that have been burned. All of a sudden, these guys who are so afraid of the liabilities, we're seeing the benefits and then, hopping on board. If you go up to the Sandhills to his brother's place, Jeff Stout, it's way less than that. Jeff is he's in the avant-garde in the Sandhills in terms of burning, and he's only doing that because he has the influence of his brother. Certainly not all of his neighbors are on board with that. Plenty of people thought it was crazy that he had started tearing out his old shelter belts. So it really depends on like the cultural buy-in you get from region to region.
Jesse, I was thinking, since your presentation seems so connected to Carson's, or to this story that Carson was telling, that maybe we should have you go and then keep the conversation happening. So let me switch. Slide we just inserted to show people the historic prairie regions. This is from the this sort of the Discovery Center in Manhattan, related to the history of the Flint Hills, shown here. And then the Nebraska Sandhills would be in here. Take it away, Jesse, thanks.
Sure. So when we think of grasslands, a common image that comes to mind are these sweeping green vistas. In these idealized landscapes, the trees are confined to regions adjacent to permanent waterways that experience reduced water stress and a reduced frequency of disturbance. Next slide. The primary disturbance that keeps trees from establishing in grasslands is fire. Fire destroys the above-ground growing points, called meristems, on woody plants, while grasses are unaffected because their meristems reside below ground. The impacts of fire can vary by intensity, frequency, and season of year, but generally grasses promote fire, while the areas with trees and grasslands suppress fire. Next slide. The highly flammable fuel of dry grasses promotes a uniform and intense fire across the landscape. Healthy grasslands naturally suppress woody plants with complete landscape fire coverage. Next slide. With the removal of woody competitors in the previous year's biomass, recently burned landscapes facilitate earlier warming of soil layers, and this warming then promotes the growth of the warm season grasses. These grasses provide nutritious forage for grazers, habitat for small animals and insects, and the grasses are key regulators of the landscape carbon, nutrient, and water cycles. Next slide. In areas where fire is variable or infrequent, the woody plants invade. Reduced fire intensity results in a variety of encroachers, riparian trees and evergreen trees that are susceptible to fire, and clonal shrubs of short and tall stature that are not vulnerable to fire and are not vulnerable to repeated cutting. In this photo, you can see smooth sumac shrubs in the foreground. You can see oaks in the riparian area, and you can see rough leaf dogwood shrubs in the background. Next slide. I've been quite fortunate to spend most of my career working at the Konza Prairie Biological Station just outside of Manhattan, Kansas. One of the real benefits of working at Konza Prairie is that we have long-term data records that now span back many decades. One of the things that we've measured over time in the same locations with a variety of burn frequency are changes in plant cover. And shrub cover, just the shrubs, over time has expanded radically based on the frequency of burning. So this data comes from areas that have bison grazing across the landscape. And even in the areas where the fire happens every year, there's been some change in shrub coverage, but nothing compared to the areas where fire is more infrequent, like the areas where fire frequency is every 4 years, or in areas where fire frequency is every 20 years. Next slide, please. In areas that have been infrequently burned and woody invasion has occurred, the effectiveness of resumed burning is often incomplete. Next slide. You can see here the clonal shrubs in green that were completely unaffected by a recent fire. And even juniper, which is fire sensitive, only exhibits partial mortality, and it's very spotty across the landscape. Next slide. There are many potential reasons for why woody plants have increased in abundance across the landscape and grassland ecosystems. These include a variety of different factors, everything from climate, which includes altered precipitation amounts, timing, and intensity, increased carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, changes in landscape fragmentation and urbanization as people move from cities into small parcels on the landscapes around cities. As people move into these small parcels, they often plant or retain trees, which brings in birds, which those birds then help disperse the seeds of those trees that are around people's homes. We've had large-scale reductions in native grazers and browsers and a complete absence of the historic migrations that would have once occurred here in North America. And there's been alterations in grazing intensity and timing. And all of this is coupled, as both Dana and Carson have alluded to, human fears of fire, especially humans of European ancestry. So this expansion of woody plants in grasslands is often known as woody plant encroachment. And as Carson has already alluded to, like colloquially here in the Great Plains, it's often referred to as the Green Glacier. Next slide, please. Woody encroachment has often been gradual, but the change is evident when it's assessed using long-term data of cover type. Here you can see encroachment in eastern Texas and Oklahoma increase over time, while Kansas and Nebraska transitioned from very low woody cover in the early 1990s to significant modern woody cover. And so scientists at Nebraska and Oklahoma State and Texas A&M and K-State and a variety of other schools have been using satellite imagery and then on-the-ground plot data to track this spread of woody plant encroachment over the broader Great Plains ecosystem. Next slide. Woody plant encroachment, though, is not just confined to the Great Plains. This map, everything in green, is considered to be the grassy ecosystems of our planet. And so you can see that this is a global phenomenon impacting all grassland types. Next slide. This applies to grassy ecosystems that aren't considered grasslands too, like alpine meadows, coastal communities, and subarctic heaths. Here with the images in different major grassland types, I've provided some example species of a broad variety of native encroaching species that are impacting our world's grassy communities. Next slide. There are a lot of impacts of woody encroachment on grassy ecosystems that are both pervasive and potentially irreversible. Next. You might think to yourself, like, what's the big deal if some of the grassy landscape is replaced by a woody one? Despite the loss of the second largest grassland region on the planet, the Great Plains, there's a lot of reasons why this phenomenon can impact your daily life. Just in the consequences that we can see visually above ground, there's reduction in forage availability for cattle, changes in biodiversity of plant and animal species, human health consequences, including changes in allergies, tick-borne diseases, and then changes in just normal grassland ecosystem services, like changes in pollination services, stream discharge, etc. Next slide. The consequences that are difficult to quantify are happening below ground, and we don't know the timescales in which these consequences can actually be mitigated. They include changes in things like soil moisture. They include changes in things like groundwater and groundwater chemistry. And they include changes in like long-term drying and changes in soil pore size and infiltration processes. Similar to plowing the soil, the processes happening below ground in areas invaded by woody plants may take decades, centuries, or multiple centuries to recover even after the woody plants are removed. Next slide. So, I frequently get asked, why haven't you tried this thing or that thing to remove the woody plants? Surely you must be trying something. Well, we are trying things. And it turns out there's no easy solutions or cheap solutions to this phenomenon. Next slide. A lot of folks tell me, why don't you burn more? Well, the burn frequency required for keeping a grassland in a grassy state has changed. We know that indigenous stewards of the landscape burned with a fire frequency of about every 4 years in this area around Manhattan, Kansas. A 4-year fire frequency now leads to widespread woody encroachment. So the background template in which we live has changed with regards to the need for fire. In addition, there are more people living here and more homeowners on the landscape, which increases personal property risk. Cutting them down works very well for junipers, although it's very expensive when you're talking about thousands of acres, because if you miss a few and the prolific seed production, it's difficult to constrain that change. In addition, as I've already mentioned, most of our shrub species resprout. So even cutting them down every year is insufficient to remove them. People have asked, can you graze or browse or change your grazing and browsing in these areas? Grazers often exacerbate the problem, and so much so as they're reducing the effective competitiveness of the grasses to suppress the woody plants. As for browsing in the Great Plains, most of our browsers were extirpated, and there's really a small niche market for starting those livelihoods back up. And then herbicides is commonly noted as a way to remedy this problem, but we know about the high collateral damage to ecosystems with broad scale, widespread herbicide use. In addition, this is very expensive for landowners. Next slide. All of these things together sort of reiterate the point that there are no easy solutions for woody plant encroachment. So for my final slide, next slide, please. I have a couple practical paths forward. And one of the messages that I want to convey at first is that there's probably going to be some amount of increased woody plant cover that's inevitable in our future Great Plains. But there are things that we can do from a variety of different contexts. As individuals, the best thing that we can do is communicate about this problem. Don't plant encroachers on your property, as Carson just showed in that previous one, and treat them when they're small. It's much easier to get rid of a knee-high cedar than it is one that's been out there for 20 years. And finally, supporting your local fire science cooperative is sort of a key endeavor in all of this. There are many agency-based solutions that are being promoted by the good folks at the USDA NRCS, Working Lands for Wildlife, and our regional Great Plains Fire Science Exchange. And these include sort of defending the core of highly functional grassland landscapes. In areas where it's still grassy and still maintains high resilience, do what you need to do to protect that, and then over time, try to expand it. Finally, there's new science coming out from K-State and other locations that's illustrating options based on site-based conditions. These conditions are shown in this sort of right-hand graphic, where on the x-axis you have grassland goods and services from low to high, and on the left y-axis you have woody cover from low to high. And if you're existing in a highly functional grassland space in that bottom right-hand corner, do what you have to do to keep it in that space. Burn, graze, treat, be highly involved. When management options become few or financial resources become low or the resilience has become eroded, it might change its state to a low functioning grassland ecosystem that's characterized by invasive species, or into the upper left-hand side, which would be like a monoculture shrub community that has low biodiversity, high fire risk, and is the one you want to avoid. This should only happen under the circumstances where fighting it is no longer financially or logistically possible. The key point, though, to make sure is that a shrubland state, like the one in the upper right-hand corner, that still maintains high grassland goods and services is not the end of the world. Having some woody plants on the landscape that exist with grassy plants can still provide some meaningful and high-value ecosystem benefits. Next slide, please. So, in summary, when I first started this, I was very focused on trying to understand the mechanisms and consequences of woody plant encroachment and the science that was behind it. And then using that, I knew, or I was very sure, my younger version of me, that we were going to come up to solutions to this problem to get back to that idealized grassy landscape that started, my portion of this talk. As I have gotten older in this job, I have realized that idealized grassy landscape across all of the Great Plains is probably not realistic. And so trying to protect what we have and then maintain high functioning parcels of land across the landscape is probably our best option. And it's probably going to provide the best societal as well as ecological benefits going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jesse. I'm going to stop share. Let's see. I'm going to try to stop share. Lost my.
It seems like it stopped.
Yeah, there we go. Escape. So that also was very interesting. And Jesse, we had talked about some things like your focus on, I think this is correct, research on shrubbery, and your sense that that may be one of the biggest challenges versus trees, which we've been talking about. But can you expand on that? Or maybe you, Carson? There's a question in the chat about, I'll go ahead and ask it. Let's see. Chat, or no, the Q&A, sorry. Wondering what your thoughts are about which contributed more to invasive tree species, timber claims and their associated tree planting requirements, or USDA subsidized installation of shelter belts and windbreaks. So we were talking about that. But yeah. Go ahead, Jesse. Sorry if that is, my question was clear. I think the one I just read was quite clear.
Well, I'll start. So in many of these grassland ecosystems around the planet, including here in the Great Plains, most of the time the encroaching woody species aren't exotic and they're not non-native. These are native species that exist in these ecosystems that are increasing in abundance for a variety of the reasons that I mentioned in my talk. And so, of course, there are exotic invasive species problems, but the species that I was referring to, these are all native species in this ecosystem, but for a variety of reasons, they are expanding and increasing in cover well beyond what they were originally. Liz, your question about the difference between trees and shrubs is slightly more nuanced, but I can do this briefly. When you think about reproduction of plants, plants can be both sexual, producing seeds, or they can be asexual, where they're just producing new stems, across the landscape. And for a lot of our shrub species, their expansion is based on asexual reproduction. So you're cutting it down and they just produce new stems below ground that then come up above ground. So even if you're burning or cutting or you've got browsers chomping them, as long as they have the carbohydrates to regrow, they just regrow new stems. That is not confined only to shrubs. Lots of trees do this as well. The locusts that you will see, across different locations are very good at coppicing and producing new stems. Eastern red cedar, one of the benefits of having it as your problem species, and there's few benefits, but one of them is it's susceptible to fire and it's susceptible to cutting. If you cut it, it doesn't come back. And if you burn it and you kill it, it does not come back. But for the shrubs and a lot of the other tree species, they do.
I might add quickly too that, the initial reason that we started planting so many eastern red cedar trees in shelter belts is because their native status meant they were easy to grow. They already fit in the landscape well enough to be a quick grower. Same with, we did a lot of cottonwood shelter belts for the same reason. It was a quick growing tree and already native to the region, so it just worked better.
And their eastern red cedar is phenomenally good at existing in very dry locations. They are a plant species that is about as drought tolerant as any plant species you'll see here in the Great Plains.
So I read the other question that came in. So would you say that the shelter belt windbreaks phenomenon, I guess it started around the 1930s, maybe, has been sort of developed into a worse problem, or was it these timber claims and tree planting requirements that you, I think, also talked about, Carson?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I can't say that, like with the Timber Culture Act, for example, that piece of legislation was like a total failure. It was mostly utilized by like land sharks. They repealed it within 20 years. Getting even a quarter of that 160 acres to grow in trees in a place like the Sandhills, nobody was succeeding in that in the first place. So the whole legislation just didn't work. So that versus the FDR era shelter belt program, I mean, that was a much more successful campaign. But do I have the numbers one way or the other to add up all the other pieces of legislation versus the shelter belt program? I don't. I would, if I had to guess, say that the New Deal stuff was maybe lasted longer, but we're now, reaching this interesting point where a lot of those shelter belts, especially the ones, planted with cottonwood, they're reaching like their 100-year maximum. So a lot of the reason we see them being torn out is because they were dying in the first place.
Interesting. I have another question here about trees and dense groves. Mentions the Manhattan's Miller Ranch and Grand Mare developments, and the entrance to Manhattan from the south. They have very dense groves of cedars, and it seems unsettling. I think we discussed the fire danger for Manhattan. Jesse, in one of our earlier conversations when we were planning, I think it was you who said that there's a lot of fear about what could happen to the city if those groves caught on fire.
Yeah, so one of my colleagues here at K-State is Dr. Zach Radizak, and he and his students from his lab have modeled changes in cedar density and proximity to houses across Manhattan. And indeed, it should be unsettling when you see how many cedars are both surrounding and distributed within Manhattan, Kansas, because a grass fire is controllable. We can control grass fires for the most part. A forest fire is very difficult to control, and it is a very different sort of burning campaign and management campaign compared to a grass fire. And when houses live in proximity to cedar, if they all catch on fire, even if your home is 50, 70, 100 feet away, the amount of energy that is released when they are all burning is very, very hot. And it would pose a very significant risk. Many of you probably are already aware, but Stillwater, Oklahoma, also has a very big cedar problem around their city. And then they lost many homes earlier this spring to a cedar fire that went into Stillwater. So this should concern all of us to see how many cedar are around our cities and like within our cities.
So would the solution be to switch to, I don't know how easy it is to get rid of those huge groves of trees, but is the solution to get rid of that particular tree and not necessarily restore to grassland around the city, but to try other trees? I mean, what would you say to that?
Carson or Dana, does one of you want to weigh in on that?
Nope.
So I believe in individuals' personal property rights. People have the ability in the United States to plant whatever they want to plant. Different trees have different fire susceptibilities, and in addition to the density in which they're planted. One of the things that cedar does is it grows very thick and it suppresses all of the fuels and substory plants that exist underneath it. And the oils in it make it particularly hot and susceptible to fire. And that is a characteristic that is of cedar that isn't for all other plant species. But it is a difficult thing to tell people to remove particular trees from their yard and replace them with other when the time period it takes for trees to grow often exceeds that of an individual property owner's lifetime. So it's a complicated thing.
Yeah, I think it's probably more productive to think about it moving forward and then asking yourself the question of the right tree in the right place.
Here's a question related to fire. So many rural areas are serviced by volunteer fire departments. They are the entity that ends up with fires gone astray. Are there any collaborative efforts occurring between those familiar with the management of trees and shrubs and these departments? Are there any funding opportunities or initiatives being proposed?
I'm not totally sure how to answer that question, but I think this is related. I did find it, I don't know if ironic is the right word or not, but the Stillwater fire that Jesse was just talking about, a ton of the cedar science originally came out of Oklahoma State. They've been talking about this issue since the late 80s. And yet it wasn't until this last fire that the Oklahoma legislature passed a bill to fight the eastern red cedar invasion. So in one sense, that's a good thing. It means I think people are finally starting to wake up to the issue. On the other hand, we should have been probably waking up a few decades before. And in terms of, the volunteer fire departments, again, I don't have an answer for that, but I do know that groups like the Loess Canyons Rangeland Alliance and others, they try to utilize those departments when they can, and they usually have to get permits from those fire departments in the first place. That can be a double-edged sword, though, because a lot of times getting approval from understaffed departments makes it pretty difficult. There's only so long that you can do a burn to begin with. And when your volunteer fire department is short-staffed, they're not going to just jump on board and say, yeah, go ahead and burn, we'll be there.
Yeah, local NRCS county agents are very aware of this situation and how important it is for conserving grassland and can provide advice. In addition, the Great Plains Fire Science Exchange that I mentioned earlier has lots of information online as well. That's very valuable.
Here's a question about windbreaks. So if you think that cedar windbreaks are problematic, what would you suggest as an alternative if you're getting going on building a windbreak? I mean, putting in place a windbreak.
Jesse?
I'd like to note I'm an ecologist, and so well, so for me personally, noting my history here, my answer to that question would be don't plant a windbreak. But that is that reveals my bias towards grassy landscapes. Not that windbreaks weren't needed in the past, but their utility for impacting livelihoods and promoting positive benefits, I think the science is in that the benefits are lower. But again, I am not a local NRCS conservation agent, but that's just my opinion. Don't plant them in the first place.
Interesting. Let's see. Well, someone asked about going back to the Nebraska National Forest, the Bessie District. Why did they pick, I don't know if you said this, probably you did. Why did they pick just conifers for that experiment? Including eastern red cedars. Do you have an idea?
Okay, I want to qualify that I'm an artist, so, but I did read a lot. And, they were looking for other places where trees could grow in sand. And as far as I know, they noted the Pine Barrens up in Michigan, in the UP. And I got to go up there a couple years ago and was blown away. I was like, wow, this actually feels like the sand hills, especially the ones that have less grass. So there are some pines, jack pines, that are native up there that was part of what they planted. So in the Nebraska National Forest, it was generally ponderosa pines, jack pines, a few other things, but mostly those two, and unfortunately, lots of eastern red cedar. And they knew the eastern red cedar would grow, and the jack pines seemed like a good idea. And then the ponderosa pines actually do grow not that far north and west of the sandhills. So in fact, there is a huge fire that's only 40% contained right now in northern Nebraska that is in ponderosa pine and grassland. It's burned 10 square miles.
You said that's today. That's now.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it was from a couple hours ago. I checked it.
That's frightening.
Yeah, it's dry here. We're in a
Yeah.
drought. Yeah.
It was also, I'd add, in terms of the Nebraska National Forest, like a simple process of elimination. They tried a lot of different species. They tried some willow, they tried other pine species, they tried a lot. They ended up with like 2 that seemed to fit pretty well, and that was the pine and the cedar.
Yeah, and just kind of interesting to me was that those jack pines are they have cones that need fire or a lot of heat to open, and so the jack pines didn't reproduce very well. There's a lot of dead jack pines, and I said, "Why are these trees dead? Do they have a disease?" And they said, "No, they just are old. Like they don't live that long, and they didn't reproduce because the cones are serotinous." But and if there's no fire, they won't, reproduce in a good way. But the ponderosa pines did a little better. They didn't, I mean, they don't do like they do in a native forest, but there are self-sown pine seedlings. And there are some from the fire too. But when we were out there, we could sort of gauge the ages of some of those jack pines and sort of trace them back to the 1965 fire.
Oh, interesting.
That were alive. Yeah, it was fascinating.
Dana has a really great timeline in her book and lots of wonderful maps. And it's an important history of that forest. I don't think anything like it existed before. Right. I have one.
I think it's unique.
Yeah. One more question, and we'll make this the last one, I think, and it circles back to you, what you said, Jesse, and that is that this person would like to know a bit more about how CO2 affects woody encroachment.
Sure. Carbon dioxide is the fuel that plants use for growth through photosynthesis. And our warm season grasses, like, here in the Great Plains and tallgrass prairies, is primarily things that you're familiar with, like big blue stem and Indian grass and switchgrass. They use a type of photosynthesis that is less benefited by increases in CO2 with regards to the rate of photosynthesis. But for the trees, increased CO2 means that they can grow faster over a shorter period of time. So elevated CO2 just by itself, not the corresponding warming and everything else, benefits the growth of the woody plants compared to the grasses they're displacing. And faster growth by those woody plants allows them to grow taller in a shorter period of time. So if you're only burning, let's say, every 3 years or every 4 years, a woody plant in a higher CO2 world can grow taller, faster, that it can shade out more of the grasses, that when that next fire comes through, the fuel of the grasses isn't there. And so the susceptibility to fire is lower. And then they can, if the woody plant survives in this new higher CO2 world, it can continue to get bigger and produce more seeds or put out more stems, and it accelerates its growth across the landscape. And this is why in all of the grassland regions of the world, the ones that are most susceptible are the regions where these warm season grasses tend to be the dominant plant.
I don't know if I'm getting this right, but are you saying that we need the tall or the grasses, the prairie, to grow well for it to burn well in order to prevent the growth of shrubs and trees?
Yeah, for fire to be effective, you have to have a healthy grass layer. And so the healthy grass layer is the key thing for fire. Grasses promote fire. And when they, in a drought year, or if there's other conditions that sort of limit their growth, even if you do burn, it's going to be ineffective or less hot, which then leads to an increased potential for the woody plants to survive.
Okay, well, does anybody else have a comment? Any of the other speakers or question?
I just thank you, Jesse. I'm like here taking notes. That's why I'm looking so weird and not at the camera. This was so amazing and fascinating to me, and I couldn't write down everything fast enough. But I was really struck by when you said that the historical fire frequency was 4 years, but now if we do that same fire frequency, we don't achieve the same plant cover, or however you want to call it. And so we are in a different world is basically the answer. Just like you explained, we need the grass for the fire. We need the fire for the woody encroachment. And without good grass, it's just like a terrible circle, it seems like. So thank you so much for explaining that. This is part of my next project.
Well, thank you to all of you for sharing your knowledge and your experiences. And yeah, I'm just really pleased to have had you here. And I hope others learned a lot, just like I did. I also want to thank Jennifer for her technical assistance and good humor always. And so good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming.